Hello, welcome everyone. Looks like we have a full house. So welcome to Flamingo's latest webinar. Excited to have you all here. So all of our webinars are very social. So we have camera ons, but one small issue is our webinar platform only limits the number of cameras that can be on to about 65. So only 65 of you will be able to be on camera. But we are still very social. So on your right hand, you can see a social feed. So definitely feel free to let everyone know where you are dialing in from and what company you are with. And then we will get started right away. So welcome. So for those of you that do not know me, my name is Jude, and I am the founder and CEO of Flamingo. So we have a really special webinar for you all about resident events and what everyone is doing for our resident events. So we at Flamingo, we live and breed resident events. So you might be wondering why Flamingo is doing a webinar like this or why we did this study. But it's because we live and breed resident events every single day. So on Flamingo's platform, we manage over 1,000 resident events every month. On our resident engagement app, we have over 1,000 resident interactions every month. We currently have over 400 units using Flamingo for events and resident engagement. So we really live and breed resident engagement. That's why we are doing this webinar for you all. So welcome. So a few quick guidelines for the webinar. So like I said, our webinars are really interactive. So if you have the opportunity, come on camera. We'll love to see your pretty face. If you are if you're not able to get on camera, you can still use our chat feature. So comment, ask questions throughout as we go. So our webinars are really, really interactive. So if you have comments, questions, feel free to post in the chat feed. And then definitely share your ideas as well. If you disagree with something, let us know. And then we are going to have a few polls throughout. So definitely complete those polls as well. So again, our webinars are really, really interactive and all about fun. So how the webinar is going to run is we are going to go through a few different things. The first is really quickly like why apartments do resident events. And then we will go through the average resident event budget, cost, look at the most popular events and the most booked events. And then my favorite is going to be talking about the trends. So that's going to be the most exciting part for this webinar. Is really like what are all the different trends that we are seeing when it comes to resident events and engagement. And then at the end of the webinar, we have some special handouts and a really, really cool offer for you all. So definitely stay tuned until the end. So for this webinar, we looked at over 760 communities, and we looked at how they do resident events. So we looked at how much they spend on events, what types of events they do, the reasons why they do events, and ultimately how they measure ROI and the overall success of events. So some key findings that we found was that one, events impact things like resident satisfaction, online reviews, and real intent. And then two, residents right now are looking for experiences, not events. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by that. And then three, the biggest challenge that we found from the survey for property managers is that when it comes to events, time and budgets are the biggest challenges that you all have. And we'll touch more on that later as well too. So one of the first things that we asked property managers was, what is the biggest challenge when it comes to resident events? And surprise, for most of you, it was time. So how do you find time to do resident events with everything else that you have going on? And so 40% of you said your biggest challenge was definitely time. And then another 29% said their biggest challenge is budget. So many of you were like, hey, we want to do all these great events, but our budgets are extremely limited. So part of the reason why we do this webinar or why we did this study is so you can actually take this back to your regional or to the owner or to corporate to say, hey, this is how much we actually need for our budget. So hopefully this helps you get a little bit more budget for 2023. And then for the other ones, they said attendance was a big challenge. So you spend all this time putting together really great events, but you don't get the attendance that you want to see. And for a small group, one of the big challenges was how do you come up with great event ideas? So for many of you, you said, we just end up doing the same event over and over again. So we kind of run out of ideas. So we'll also talk about the trends that we are seeing and some event ideas that might help you kind of drive a little bit more engagement and move towards experiences rather than just events. So the first thing that we wanted to understand was why apartment communities do resident events. So it seems obvious, but it's not always obvious. So one of the key things, the top 3 reasons that came out were, 1, people were looking to build a really strong sense of community, and the ultimate goal was to increase satisfaction and renewals. And then 2, they were looking to really increase online reviews, which at the end of the day is going to improve foot traffic and then interest in the property. And then 3, a lot of you were looking to improve conversions by standing out from competitors that only focus on amenities and not so much experiences. So this was a really interesting case for why people do events. One of the next questions that we asked was, how is this measured? And that's one of the core things that we learned from this outreach, is that a lot of you are really keen on these, on having this level of impact, but very few are actually measuring the ROI of events. So very few of you are actually measuring how events are actually impacting resident satisfaction or actually impacting renewals, or tracking who is attending events and if they renew at a higher rate than the people not attending events. So that was one of the key opportunities that we found from the study, is we know why you want to do events and this is why. But as of now, no one is really tracking and actually seeing if the impact from events is actually happening. And that's a really key opportunity, because if you have that data, then it's going to allow you to get a much bigger budget. If you can say, hey, we did these number of events and these people attended, and these are the people that renew at a 20% higher rate than the people that did not attend, that only renew at a 10% rate. So opportunity for everyone is really being able to track the impact of events and how those things match up to the reasons why you do events. So a quick way to really stand out at your job is to be able to show exactly how events are impacting the key metrics. So besides looking at the quantitative data, we also look at some of the more qualitative parts of it. So for one community, we had this really nice quote from one of the residents who said, I absolutely love it here. I love my view, the events, the community, the people. I smile when I make the turn into my complex. So this is Bell's Bluff in Nashville, managed by Elmington. So if you think about events, it's obvious why you do events, but it's always nice to look at the quantitative, but it's also helpful to look at the qualitative. So for many of you, you spend a lot of time on events. One of the things that we found is that there really is a real impact on the resident experience from events. And this quote, more than anything else, really encapsulates that for why your residents love living where you are, where you guys manage, because of all the work that you guys put in. So first poll is, before we go into what we actually found for resident event budgets, is how much, for the people on the call, how much you all currently budget for resident events. So you should get a poll on the right-hand side of the screen. So we'll take a few minutes to complete that poll. Okay, excellent. So we have that poll completed. The other poll, so I actually put the wrong poll initially. So excuse me, first time moderator. But I restarted a new poll for event budget, but you guys are really on top of it. You've really completed the second poll that we are going to have later. So I'll give it a few more minutes, and then in the meantime, we can enjoy more of Tay Cruz with Dynamite. Excellent. So I am going to close out the poll. And really good results for the poll so far. So we got 4 responses. And for 4% of you, you don't have any budgets for events. For 39% of you, your event budgets are 100 to 500. And then for 50% of you, your event budgets are between 500 and 700. And then for 12% of you, your budgets are between 701 to 1,000. And then for 8% of you, your budgets are between 1,000 and 1,500. And then for 11%, your budgets are 1,500 to 2,000. And then for 11% of you, your budgets are more than 2,000 per month. So this is very much in line with what we found when we looked at how 760 communities do events and what they budget for those events. So when it comes to events and budget, it definitely ranges across the board. But we saw a couple of really important themes. So what I want to go through is exactly how we broke those down. So when we did our survey, we looked at a few different metrics. So the type of community, if it's a lease up, if it's an active senior, if it is luxury property, if it's mid-end, or if it's low-end. And what we found is that on average, apartments budget just about 900 per month for their event budgets. So really in line with what we see in the survey that you all completed. So one of the most interesting parts was that the event budgets were really all over the place. So we saw properties with budgets as low as 200, and we saw properties with budgets as high as 7,000. So really all across the board, but they all fell within like specific buckets. So across all the 760 plus, the average was 870. And then for lower end properties, their event budgets were just about 400 per month. And then for mid-end properties, their budgets were just about 700. And then for really high-end properties, their monthly budgets were about 1,600 per month. And then lease-ups came in a little bit higher with about 1,675. For lease-ups, they were really interesting because they were all over the place. So some lease-ups had budgets of 500, And then other lease ups had budgets of up to like 15,000. So they're like all over the place. And then the highest across the board were active adult. So because they do a lot of events, their budgets were typically much, much higher. So on average, it was just about 30,000. But we also found active seniors with budgets of about 10,000 per month. And for many of them, they have dedicated event staff that just focus on events, on fitness classes, and a few other things. But they came out to be the ones with the highest budgets across the board, which makes sense because for that demographic, that population, they are really looking for engagement, and that's why they move into those communities. But the lesson for conventional multifamily is that there is still a lot to be done on the budget side of things. So curious for everyone on the call, is this aligned with what you all expected? Is this aligned with the budgets that you have? I would love to see some comments on your thoughts around this budget, these averages, and if this is in line with what you all like expected. So definitely feel free to comment in the chat queue. And then the next thing that we did is we broke this down a little bit more into some of the large NMHC, like top 50 property management companies, to look at how they typically budget for their events. So on the higher end, we saw that TGM and Berkshire typically dedicated more to budgets. So their average budgets were just over 1,000. And then right up there were like Greystar and Lincoln, and their budgets were just around like 900 per month. And then Bozzuto came up right afterwards with 800 per month for their budgets. And then we also saw that for Mill Creek, Brookfield, BH, and Avalon Bay, they averaged just about 700 for their budgets. And then for other ones, we saw some a little bit lower from like Bells to Avenue 5. But across the board, a lot of the properties fell around like the 870 for the NMHC, like 50. But definitely a wide range for what they budgeted for events. And then we also looked at cost. So on Flamingo's platform, apartments are able to book events. So we looked at the average event cost based on thousands of bookings. And what we found is that the average event typically comes out to be around $741. So for most communities, what that means is their budgets are just enough for about one event per month. And then we also looked at a breakdown for like fitness classes. And what we found is that for a lot of communities, they spend just about $100 per month or $100 per fitness class. And then for properties that offer a fitness program. So what we define as a fitness program is you do about 3 fitness classes per week. So we found that on average for apartments that offer an actual fitness program, they typically spend about $1,200 per month on fitness. And then next, we looked at what were the most popular and impactful events. And I'll come back to this as well. One of the key things that we found is that residents are now really looking for this more than just events. So we looked at all the data and we found that there were a lot of different types of events that are being done, but the most popular events were, you would guess it, the events that always included food. So some of the standout events that we found and most popular were like happy hours. So across the board, there were a lot of happy hour events. So a lot of them during the week, during the weekend. So those typically came out to be the most popular event. And it makes sense intuitively because these are much easier to put together. And it's one thing that residents always resonates with residents. But when I talk about trends, I'll talk about like why you shouldn't focus as much on happy hour type events and the feedback that we've received from residents. And next on the list were outdoor movie events. So this one came out really strong the last few months. A lot of people utilizing their outdoor space to host really fun outdoor movie events. And then the next was like pool parties. So this is definitely a mainstay of most apartments, like event mix is a pool party. So what we've also seen is that for a lot of properties, they do just 1 or 2 events throughout the year, but then they go all out either for their pool party or for the holiday party. So the pool party is definitely one of the most popular and most common one that we've seen across the 760 communities that we looked at. And then next up were like food truck events. So food truck events also super popular. And one of the reasons we heard for why people do the food truck events is that it's really quick and easy. You simply call a food truck, they come, and you have the opportunity for residents to pay for the food truck or for you to budget and pay for the food truck yourself. So that one we also found to be really popular, and it's a quick event to do as well. One that kind of came out of nowhere was a pie and wine tasting event. So we saw that booked a lot, and apparently it's a super, super popular event. So that was definitely a very random one that me personally, I was not expecting to see. So we saw a few of those. So the other ones that we saw were like yoga brunch events, sushi making classes, coffee making classes are always popular. And then a few magician performances. So another like fun event, which is really nice because it's one that is great for communities that have families, kids. It's not just for the millennials or the whoever. So another popular one that we saw. And then the mainstays that many of you are familiar with, like the wine and paint events. So those are always like popular. So these are really the ones that to be the most popular within the last about 8 months. And then next, what we wanted to look at as well was everyone spends a fair amount of time and money on events, but what is the actual impact of events? So what we did for this is we looked at how events correlate with a few key metrics. So resident satisfaction, online reviews, the number of online reviews, and then like social media followers. So one of the important things that we found is we looked at how events correlate with all of these different things. One of the really cool things that we found is that apartments that have the top 10% of highest online reviews budget on average of $1,100 per month for resident events. And then the apartments with the bottom 10 lowest reviews or lowest average reviews, they budgeted about $693 per month for events. So that's how we actually started off the study. So we looked at how do budgets impact the top 10 and then the bottom 10. So we saw a really nice correlation between those. So next, we wanted to go much deeper. So we looked at the actual numbers. So how do event budgets actually impact and correlate with things like resident satisfaction, number of online reviews, the average of online reviews, and then number of Instagram followers. So looking at the polls that you all completed, so for you all, 50% said events definitely impact resident satisfaction. 24% said it definitely impacts the number of online reviews. 17% said it definitely impacts the online review average. And then 9% said it impacts the number of Instagram followers. So all over the place there. So we looked in depthly at each of these. And what we found is that for residents and for property managers and for all the data that we looked at, there was a positive correlation between a couple of these. So we found positive correlation between event budget and resident satisfaction. So through these, we did what is called like a Pearson correlation, which is looking at how the number of one thing correlates with the number of something else. So for resident satisfaction, we found a positive correlation between event budget and resident satisfaction. And then for number of online reviews, we found no correlation between the number of online reviews you have and your actual event budget. But we did find a positive correlation between event budget and the online reviews average. So really events do impact your online reviews average. And then we also looked at how event budget correlates with the number of Instagram followers. So how do events impact your social media presence? And we also found a positive correlation between that. So really interesting that it impacts all these things, but it doesn't impact like the number of online reviews. And I have some pieces about that we'll talk about as well as we go through the webinar. So we looked at what the numbers actually told us, and then we decided to go much deeper to see how much more in depth do events impact a few core things, including resident satisfaction and renewals. So we did a much deeper analysis to look at how events impact satisfaction. So one of the really important things that we found is that in 89% of cases where a resident mentioned events in their feedback, their resident satisfaction was typically happy or very happy. So what this means is when residents organically talk about events or lack of events, we found really good correlation between their satisfaction and if the community had events or not. And then in 87% of cases where a resident mentioned the lack of resident events, their resident happiness was typically neutral, unhappy, or very unhappy. So this is where we went really, really in depth to look at for residents, how do their satisfaction correlate with what they say when they provide feedback on a month-to-month basis. So a lot of residents organically mention events in their feedback for how satisfied they are with their property. So when we looked at this, we found some really interesting quotes from residents that we kind of sifted through like thousands of different quotes to find ones that really encapsulated how residents feel about their property. So for one property in Golden, Colorado, the residents said they were very unhappy. They said the property is not supporting our activities. Art workshops and active minds are gone. The educational events and adventurous excursions according to the website and the sales brochure we were given. And they don't seem to care that we are disappointed. So a resident that deeply cares about like events and was sold on the property based on the events and the activities that were listed on the website. So just something that's really important is residents do pay attention and the events are things that they really care about. And then for another resident for a community in Oakland, California, whose satisfaction at that point was very happy. She said great events and staff, lots of opportunities to meet neighbors, and amenities are top notch. And their satisfaction was very happy. And then for another resident who said great events and food trucks, their satisfaction was correlated with very happy. And then for one community in Indianapolis, the resident, their current satisfaction was very unhappy. They said no events, does not inform tenants of events. If there are any, would love to go if told with proper advance notice. So someone that cares about events and their satisfaction with the community is directly tied to events. And then we also did a deeper analysis on how resident events correlate with renewal intent. So for residents that are happy or for residents that mention events in their feedback on if they are going to renew, what were they saying? So in 62% of cases where a resident mentioned the presence of events, they rated their likeliness to renew as yes or probably. And then in 100% of cases, this is the one that was like most shocking to us, is that in 100% of cases where a resident mentioned lack of events, they rated their likeliness to renew as no or probably not. So this is interesting because these were all organic. So we simply looked at the data for when a resident said they were going to renew or not renew, and then we looked at all the reasons like why. And in 100% of cases where someone said they are not going to renew, they mentioned lack of events. So we went even deeper and we literally went through and sifted through like thousands of feedback that residents have said. So for one resident in Glenview, she had to renew. She said yes, she's going to renew. And then in the follow-up feedback, she said, I'm enjoying meeting new people and having a variety of events to enjoy. The staff is friendly and helpful. And then for another resident in Tocaho, who said she is probably going to renew. She said, I love it here. Great management, great neighbors. It's clean and so many cool events that I need to partake in. And then for another property in Greenville, South Carolina, when asked if the resident is going to renew, they said no. And then we looked at the reasons why. And he said no good social events like in years past. So again, residents really pay attention to events. And when you have property management transitions, that's when events typically fall off. And for your past residents, that's something that they become used to. So it does impact their desire to renew or not renew. And then for another property in Fremont, California, this resident said they are probably not going to renew. And they said current amenities and events don't justify the cost. So again, residents are definitely alluding your events to their desire to renew or not renew. For us, really the most interesting part for this was that in 100% of cases where someone said they were not going to renew or probably not going to renew, and then they mentioned lack of events, it correlated 100% completely. So events really do have an impact on what your renewals are and how residents feel about the property. And then for me, the most exciting part of this whole thing was looking at resident event trends and opportunities. So what are the things that residents are saying? What are people doing to really drive engagement even further? And where are the opportunities to really take your events and engagement to the next level? So we found a couple of really interesting trends. One of the really big ones was that residents are really now asking for events over experiences rather than events. And a lot of you are 100% delivering on that. So we've seen a huge shift from people doing things like breakfast grab and goes to doing more things that are more experiential. So rather than a breakfast grab and go, we're seeing people doing like rooftop yoga or brunch and mimosas events. So things that are more experiential rather than just like a quick thing to do. And then we've seen a lot of people move away from happy hours to cocktail making classes. I showed earlier that happy hours were still like the most popular events that we see, but we've seen a lot of people transition from happy hours to more hands-on like cocktail making classes or things that allow residents to really learn a skill or do something else. And then the thing too, we're seeing people transition from like a pizza party to more of a pizza making class. So again, a lot of things that are focused on experience or residents are learning a new skill. So that's one of the biggest trends that we've seen, and also one of the biggest opportunities that we highly recommend for you all. And then another trend that we're seeing is that in the past, a lot of events completely fell on the on-site team. So one trend that we're seeing is that a lot of properties are now outsourcing events to third parties. So really taking events out of the hands of the on-site teams. And the reasons we have heard for why they want to do that is many of the corporate teams are wanting the on-site teams to actually participate in those events and form those one-on-one relationships with the residents rather than trying to run the event themselves. So that's the big reason why we see a lot of companies are looking to now transition to more outsourcing events so that on-site teams can actually participate in events and form those relationships with the residents. Another cool thing that we saw is that in feedback, residents are becoming more and more vocal about exactly what they want. So many of you have been doing events for the last 5 years. So 10 years ago, very few properties did events. Within the last few years, more and more are doing events regularly. So residents have become really used to events. And a lot of them are now very, very specific with the types of events that they want to see. And it's really become an expectation for them. So we saw a couple of really interesting things that residents are now requesting, and they have become extremely vocal. So for some residents, they are really now becoming more jaded with the happy hour type events or with the alcohol fueled events. So many of them are now looking for things that go beyond that. So Ashley, for an Oakland-based property, said, I'd love to see the community events and programming that promotes something other than drinking, like a book club, community meals, cooking classes, dance classes. So someone looking for something beyond just like people hanging out and drinking. The other one that we saw is a lot of residents are asking for more educational type events. So this resident for Golden, Colorado said there should be educational events and adventure excursions. So someone looking for events, also looking for events like beyond the building. So things that go offsite. And then residents are also demanding like specific things that they want to see based on what the community has. So this resident for a property said, how about a social by the pool with possibly a musician playing? So we've seen like hundreds of these examples where residents are really asking specifically for the types of events that they want to see. And what I highly recommend is utilize that feedback. So do a poll, ask your residents like what kind of events they want to see, and then really execute on those events. Another interesting trend that we've seen is that a lot of companies are now hiring dedicated corporate event hosts or corporate event staff. So someone that's dedicated just to do events across the whole portfolio. So one part of the reasons we've heard for this is that a lot of corporate teams are looking to remove at least like one more thing off of the on-site team's plate. So definitely a win for many of you. So what we see is a bunch of companies are now having really dedicated event staff. So they just focus completely on executing events across the portfolio. So we've seen this for companies like Veris, Equity Residential, Demert, and a few other places that are really focused on driving engagement across the portfolio by having someone that's fully dedicated, or a few people that are fully dedicated to executing on events. And the reasons we've heard for this range from looking to free time for the on-site teams to having people that really understand events and can really be dedicated to that function. So rather than events just kind of being something that's happens randomly, a team that is completely focused on driving events. So for me, this is probably one of the most exciting trends that I have seen across the board. And then another really interesting trend we're seeing is a lot of properties are now utilizing offsite events. So we saw a Denver community, they did a ski trip with their residents. We saw an Oakland-based community, they went to a soccer game with the residents. We've seen communities rent a space at a bar to host the event at the bar and then just have like wristbands. So lots of different ways to incorporate events that are already taking place around the property. And the reasons we've heard for doing this are because, one, it's less work for the on-site teams. So rather than the on-site team having to do everything to execute the event, they are now just utilizing things that are already taking place around the property or within the city. So another interesting trend to really consider is offsite events and taking advantage of what's already happening around town. And then another interesting trend we're seeing is some companies are looking to actually use resident events as a revenue activity. So the logic behind this is that if a resident is willing to drive downtown to attend a cooking class where that resident pays like $75 for a 90-minute cooking class, why not hire a chef, bring that chef to the property, and then charge residents like $20 to $30 to attend the cooking class? That's another trend that we're seeing. We don't have enough data to say this is something we would recommend or not recommend. But we've spoken to a few companies that are looking to do this or have done this a little bit, but something else to like consider or experiment with. And then another trend that we're seeing is like partnerships with national brands. So this is a really exciting opportunity because for many of you, you manage Class A properties with really high income earners. So for some property management companies, they are looking at that as an opportunity. So brands, whether it's BMW or Coke, or you name any like national brand, those are their exact customers. So we are seeing some companies partner with those like large national brands for those brands to provide what I call like activations. So the brand pretty much comes on site and does like a fun free event. I know many of you have done like events with like Comcast or Xfinity, but this is extending that to like larger and more consumer-facing brands who are able to come on site and do a pop-up or activation And the goal for them is that it allows them to be in front of high income earners. So another interesting trend that we are seeing across the board. And then another really cool trend that we're seeing is that more people are starting to tie events to real outcomes and ROI. One of those is to online reviews and social media. So a really great opportunity is to ensure that you have processes and systems in place that turn every event into an actual review or into user-generated content. So for some of our clients, they bring out iPads at events, or they have QR codes or other things to really get residents to leave reviews. For other clients, is you simply take the list of people that attended the event, and after the event, simply send them an email to say, hey, please leave us a review on Google, Facebook, Yelp, or whatever review site you are looking to concentrate in. So this is one really quick way to boost your online presence, is to really focus on the ROI of events. And we are seeing a lot of people really starting to focus on that. So not just do a fun event, but actually make sure that there is some ROI from that event. So highly, highly recommend focusing on this part. And then another cool trend that we are seeing, and something else we have been recommending for a while now, is to invite prospects to your events. So many of you mentioned that we are doing events, but we don't get high attendance. So you can supplement that and help the leasing team by inviting prospects to events. So if you have a happy hour or whatever event, simply look at the list of prospects that you have that are on the fence and invite them to that event. It's a great opportunity for them to really interact with their future neighbors and to see what you all are about. Think of it as a free trial. So definitely invite prospects to events and find a good process to do that. And then another really cool trend that we are seeing for our portfolio clients is that a lot of companies are doing portfolio-wide events, especially events over Zoom. So this is a leftover from the pandemic when everything was over Zoom. So if you manage a portfolio of, or if you have a portfolio of 500, 10,000, whatever number of units, doing virtual events where you invite the whole portfolio is a really great way to, one, help residents understand like how big the portfolio is, and also to take advantage of new technology, and also it's a cost savings. So the events that typically work well for something like this include like virtual paint and sip events, includes virtual trivia, or any events where you can have hundreds of people, if not thousands. So this is another trend that we are seeing for like large portfolios that are looking to drive engagement from a corporate wide perspective. So definitely another cool trend. And then another one that we're seeing, and something that's also reflected off of what residents are asking for, are like non-social events. I couldn't think of a better word for this, but it's basically residents are asking for like educational opportunities. So we've seen a couple of clients that do like career development workshops or resume workshops, or just things that residents would benefit from, but it's not necessarily a social event. So definitely something to think about as you think about your event mix for 2015 is, what are some of those like non-social events that you could do to really drive engagement while also helping residents out. So it could be as simple as a workshop on resume writing. So highly recommend incorporating some of these and testing them out for your specific community. And then another really cool trend that we've seen is resident-initiated activities. So this is a fun one for any busy property manager, is how do you provide and put systems in place that allow residents to create their own events? So we are seeing that across the board, and it's something that residents are proactively doing themselves. So the next step is to give them the tools that they need in order to create their own events. So on here is a real example from one property where the residents have created their own like monthly like book club, We've seen that across the board. We've also seen people have like monthly meetups where they watch a specific like Netflix show. So as much as you can, encourage your residents and provide them the tools to create their own events. One, that's going to save you a lot of time. And then two, it's just like free engagement. So you don't really have to do any work when it comes to doing that. So another really cool thing we've seen is like resident initiated events. And then another one that we're seeing is that a lot of companies are now complementing their events with a resident engagement app. So with events, if you do one event per month, you get on average about 60 interactions between your residents. But with a resident engagement app, residents are engaging about just over 1,000 times per month. So residents are constantly messaging each other. They are finding ways to support each other. So a highly recommended thing is implement an engagement app to complement your events. It's going to allow residents to connect with each other beyond the events. One of the big mistakes we see is people do all these fun events, residents attend, but then those residents like have no way to follow up or to connect, and they actually forget who they actually spoke to. So with an engagement app, it allows you to extend the number of interactions and engagement that you get from the events that you are already doing. So a really nice and solid way to complement your events is to also implement an engagement app to further that. And then another trend that we're seeing, which is really helpful, is tracking event metrics and analytics. So we found that for about 60% of the people that we surveyed, a lot of them were not actually tracking any type of event metrics from the previous years. But now a lot more people are now cognizant and are looking to track really important metrics to see what the impact of events are. So tracking like event attendance, providing like post-event feedback to residents to actually know how that event went, and then really putting processes in place to track how each event you do impacts your online reviews. So counting how many reviews were generated from each event that you did. So a really important metric to track on a constant basis. And then another one is user-generated content. So looking at how much user-generated content you get from events. So our residents taking pictures at events and sending those to you. Our residents posting on social media and tagging the building because of those events. So a lot of communities are now looking to tie user-generated content with events. And then the big one is renewals. So tracking how events that you do actually impact renewals. So looking at the different populations that you have and looking at who attends events, and if those people attending events are also the same people that renew at a higher rate than the people not attending events. So the reason why I love seeing this is because this ultimately is what is going to help justify more budget for your events. So if you are able to show the management team, like this is the impact our events have. We have increased renewals by 5%, by 10%. That is going to help you get a lot more budget for events. So highly recommend that you all really focus on tracking your event ROI and using that to justify more budgets, or to actually, if you see that events don't have impact, then maybe you don't need to do it anymore. But having the metrics to actually do that, that's really the next phase that we see. So another really cool trend that we are seeing. So we just have a few more things, but in the meantime, if you have questions, definitely type them into the chat and I'll respond as we go through. Cool. So that is the final part of the webinar. So cool, a few things post-webinar. So we are going to send you a PDF that has the actual event report. So all the data that I went through, but with more details. So we'll send that to you along with the webinar recording. So don't forget to follow, subscribe to Flamingo's Apartment Rebels podcast. So we have a really nice podcast where we interview people in the industry that are really shaking things up. So I highly recommend that. And then follow us on LinkedIn. We have a bunch of really fun content that we post, including like memes that you will love. And then for today, we have a couple of handouts that we are sharing with you all. So I'm sharing those and you can quickly download those. So we have a couple of handouts for you all. One is the fall version of Flamingo's Resident Engagement and Experience magazine. So the fall version has, I think, over 50 event ideas for fall. So definitely check it out if you are trying to figure out what events you should be doing for the fall. And then we also just shared like how Apple would run your apartment. So a really fun article that we put together, along with how McDonald's would also run your apartment. And then we also included the Multifamily Impact magazine. So you should be getting those, and you can download them as a pop-up. And then now for the other things, we have a few other upcoming webinars for you to be aware of. One is our fall resident event ideas webinar. So that's next Friday, October 7th at 12:30. And then another really popular webinar that we have is Inside Hacks to Skyrocket Your Resident Reviews. So this is on Friday, October 28th. So we have helped companies increase reviews or gain like 100 plus reviews per year. So super helpful webinar to attend. And then later, we're going to send this out, but our holiday event ideas webinar, and then 101 ways apartments can earn ancillary revenue. And then we are also going to have our multifamily salary report. So if you are wondering if you're being paid enough, this is definitely a webinar to attend. So highly recommend that one. And then lastly, we have a special offer for the people attending the webinar. We are offering like $5,000 in free event credits if you are looking to pilot Flamingo's event marketplace for your portfolio. So I am sharing that as well. But we are offering like $5,000 for portfolios of 5,000 plus units to test out Flamingo's event marketplace. So free event credits, you can book really all the events that we have on the platform, and you can test it out. So you get up to 500. So I just shared the offer with you all. So if you want to book a demo to learn more about that offer or to activate it, book a meeting with one of our team members. So that is our webinar. So thank you all for attending. So a big takeaway for this is that we heard from a lot of property managers that their biggest stress point is the time it takes to do events and the limited budgets that they have. So highly recommend you guys share this with your leadership team to say, hey, we need more budget, and here are the reasons like why. So next week, we will share the actual report with you all. So thank you all for attending our webinar. So a couple of questions that we have. One from Rebecca Shirley. So if you have a community that is not purchasing Flamingo monthly, can they still use your event planning app? Yes. So if you are interested in Flamingo's app, you don't have to use us for events as well. And then Carrie Austin, do you have tracking forms? Are you asking about RSVPs, or what do you mean by tracking forms, Carrie? So while we wait for that, tracking forms for resident events. Yep. So on Flamingo's platform, we do have a way for you to track event attendance. So you can track all the data and the metrics that I mentioned earlier, whether it's event RSVPs or satisfaction after event. It's able to track all of those. So thank you all for attending our latest webinar. So we hope to see you on our other upcoming webinars. And so we will share all the information with you all next week, plus the recording from this call. So hope you all have an amazing Friday. Bye, everyone.